Hello viewer, the Nameless Scholar here, and welcome back to more Age of Sigmar lore. Now, before I begin, my voice might sound a bit off because I was sick and only recently have I healed, so you'll have to forgive me for that one. Anyways, today I will be covering the Soulblight Gravelords, more commonly known as the Vampire Counts. The vampires of Age of Sigmar are vastly different than the traditional vampires. You know the traditional vampire weaknesses, right? Sunlight, stakes to the heart, silver, garlic. All of them are rumors made up by the Soulblight themselves. There's a rumor that vampires cannot walk on Hyash. No, that's not true. Sure, they don't like how bright it is there, but aside from that, nothing happens. Vampires in Age of Sigmar are essentially Blade from Marvel, but not a half-vampire. Not only that, they are one of the strongest magic casters in all of the mortal realms, particularly over the lore of death. For every Soulblight command vast armies of undead. As for their thirst for blood, they don't die when they don't drink blood. They turn into a bat creature that is obsessed with nothing but feasting on gore. Vampires can sustain themselves with animal blood, but most choose not to. They prefer sapient blood. It's similar to how in the real world a Jew wouldn't eat pork due to kosher laws. Pigs, as cute as they are ultimately dirty animals that will eat anything, including their own excrement. And vampires also cannot drink all types of sapient blood. A vampire could drink an orc or goblin blood and essentially just be unharmed. However, it would only give them temporary strength and wits, rather than being a replacement for human or elf blood, due to it being infused with the power of Gorka Morka. They could drink an ogre's blood, but it wouldn't be nourishing enough due to the ogre's natural resistance to magic, not going well with vampire physiology, as well as the primal energies of Gorka Morka being present. They could try drinking lizardmen blood, but it would be like if a human drank non-poisonous paint. Not harmful, but not nourishing either. Because the cold blood of lizardmen is not the same as the warm blood of human and elves. Even dwarf blood isn't as sustaining as human or elf blood, because dwarves are also, like ogres, highly resistant to magic, so the only blood they can drink are that of humans and elves while still being sated. Meanwhile, some types of blood are outright harmful to vampires, such as Skaven blood, which is full of diseases, chaos, corruption, and traces of warpstone, or demon blood, or even the blood of a chaos-corrupted individual, as the raw, corrupting magic doesn't go well with their physiology. And in the same way, they also cannot drink Stormcast blood, as the Stormcast are reforged to be the anathema of chaos, death, and destruction alongside their corruption. Because a lack of drinking blood turns vampires into monsters, they hide this with a veneer of sophistication and aristocracy. For no vampire can truly escape their nature as bloodthirsty undead monsters. Now, some of them genuinely want to be aristocratic and sophisticated. They sadly acknowledge the fact that they are one step away from becoming beasts. They could have charisma to even make their mortal subjects at least both respect and fear them. They could use chaos or other death factions as scapegoats, claiming that as long as they pay their blood tithe, the vampire lord will use his vast undead legions to protect his mortal subjects from the worst things out there. Some might not even rule subjects, but treat mortals as cattle. Some might be somewhere in between. Vampires are, after all, very individualistic. Which leads me to this. Like all undead, vampires are bound to Nagash. Unlike other undead, they have free will to a point. Even though this is against his tyrannical nature, The vampires' ability for independent thought is actually used by Nagash to have them act as his generals. Because vampires are capable of independent thought, when Nagash threatened the mortal realms with the Necroquake, it is true that the vampires turned a blind eye to the Skaven ruining the Great Necromancer's plans. Because if there are no mortals to drink the blood of, the vampires would all turn into beasts, and the Soulblight have used Alariel's Right of Life to not only take more mortals to sustain themselves, but also to expand their own dynasties, which all originate in Shyish, the Realm of Death, because it is the domain of the Great Necromancer. His idols are scattered across everywhere. There are night black rivers and fortresses made of bone. Mortals exist, but aside from Sigmarite territory, the true rulers of Shyish belong to the White Kings and Necromancers, at least in the case of the Soulblight. During the Age of Chaos, at the Battle of Black Skies, Archaon had defeated Nagash, which forced him to retreat into the deepest, blackest pit of the underworld, which was in Styx, to recover, and as even the undead were on the back foot, many a dynasty has been driven to extinction by Archaon and his forces. But Sigmar's Tempest has taken some weight off of the Soulblight and Nagash's shoulders. Now, the organization of the Soulblight is a complex hierarchy where Nagash is at the top. No contest. Underneath them are his Mortarchs, because we are talking about the vampires here. Those would be Queen Neferata, the Mortarch of Blood, and Manfred von Kastein, who is the Mortarch of Night. Aside from the Mortarchs, the matriarchs and the patriarchs of a dynasty are present. They are typically the oldest member of a brood. Some vampires, however, go out of their way to found their own dynasties, the most famous and largest of these being the Vyrkos, Kastelai, and the Avengorii Dynasties. The vampires who have pledged themselves to the Mortarch of Night are the most tyrannical and cruel of all. They are the Legion of Night, also known as the von Kastein Dynasty. They are dirty fighters and have no concept of honor. Manfred and vampire lords under him seek to only expand their charnel empires by whatever means necessary. They could send necromancers as infiltrators to a besieged city, or revive villagers that died from a disease and spread the sickness further. The creed of the Legion is, "Virtue was the preserve of the revenants now slaved to our will." Manfred is as hungry for conquest as he is for blood. He spends little time in his own domain of Carstinia, which is filled with bleak moors, broken treasures, and squalor peasant villages ruled by his underlings. While he and his hordes of undead are on conquest, Manfred will even screw over his own allies, such as during the time of Invidia. He annexed territories belonging to his supposed ally Neferata, and personally depleted her bloodstock. However, because this is Manfred, he can only push around his fellow Mortarchs, and because he is essentially lobotomized, he does not seek freedom from Nagash. He's just a slave. Speaking of, there is also the Legion of Blood, led by Neferata, who is the first vampire in ancient history dating back to the world that was, and her dynasty is a reflection of her. On the outside, it looks like macabre sophistication as her armies march forwards. Underneath, however, is determination to make sure the battle is won before it even begins. It is true that Neferata's armies comprise of skeletal soldiers with scarlet and purple banners, while vampire aristocrats bet on how long their enemies will resist before they fold, or until they get bored and move in for the kill. Meanwhile, Queen Neferata has turned her queendom of New Lamia into a web of conspiracies, where she can run 100 plots and counter plots at once. To catch her eye and be accepted into her court, a vampire must utilize the traditional methods of espionage. The Vyrkos Dynasty is a special case where they are blunt about their bestial side, led by their matriarch Belladama Volga. They are cruel, brutish and domineering. They seek to master both the human and the bestial side, and it's sooner or later that the bestial side wins out. There's a reason why the Vyrkos have the most amount of Vargheists among the other major Soulblight dynasties. However, the Vyrkos are unique among the Soulblight, where they are the Space Wolves of Age of Sigmar. Unlike the Space Wolves post-War of Armageddon, however, they are actually well written by details. The reason why I am saying this is because they are practically both vampires and werewolves, with the vampire side being more dominant. Even then, they like to wear pelts and rugged furs. The reason for this is because the Vyrkos' mythos involve them essentially getting their boon from the god beast Hrunspul. However, certain Shyish scholars insist that this god beast was Nagash in disguise. Now, the Vyrkos is a very small dynasty, as most mortals who go through the Blood Kiss tend to mutate into monsters, rather than vampires. Only a few survive, which make the Vyrkos a close-knit community. The era of the beast also hasn't helped them, as many of the vampire lords devolved into hideous monsters known as Varkskirs. Alongside that, their capital of Ulfenkarn is all but ruined. However, hope is not lost for them, as a vampire lord named Ivya Volga has returned and vowed to make the city greater than it was before. Before I begin to talk about their founder, I want to explain that one day Manfred von Carstein and Neferata will be covered in their own videos. However, Ivya Volga and Radukar will also be covered in the same video. Or maybe I will cover them in a separate video should I ever cover Ulfenkarn. The founder of the Vyrkos dynasty is one matriarch Belladama Volga, who is essentially the boogeyman with so many tales that it could fill a library. There are contradictory information as to how she became the matriarch of the Vyrkos in the first place. Some say that she impressed Hrunspul with her feral resolve. Others claim that she tricked it. Some even say that she brought the creature to its knees, and this allowed her to gain the favor of Nagash. There are also many myths about Volga by the mortals too. One tale of Stygian tribes say that a young girl once lost in the woods and encountered Volga. She was warned with warm broth. However, in forgetting her manners, Volga transformed her kin into wolves. Another myth involves that the vampire king Rofabak attempted to romance Volga like she's in an RPG, boasting about his strength. But Volga was not interested. She turned him into a giant wolf that she rides at night. But if you thought that the Vyrkos were brutes, oh boy, you haven't seen the Avengorii Dynasty. These have abandoned any notion of nobility and aristocracy by embracing the fury of gore, which is why they are more bloodthirsty than the other vampires and why they have more Vargheists than other dynasties. The Avengorii have a unique way of interpreting Nagash. They see Nagash as a primal force of nature who allowed them to embrace their unholy essence, so their eccentric beliefs make them shunned by the other dynasties. The home of the Avengorii dynasty is located underneath the Saskafran dunes of Gur. Their fortresses are of stalactites crafted by an unknown civilization eons ago, and they have been claimed by the Avengorii. On the exterior of these caverns crawl terrorgeists and zombie dragons. And what is terrifying about these caverns is that it is said that at the deepest depths of the cavern systems lies the Voidmaw, which is a realm gate that goes straight to the Shyish Nadir. The matriarch of the Avengorii dynasty is one Laukavai. She is divided between the honor-bound vampire and the grotesque beast that the lower half of her body has become. Even despite all of this, despite looking like a grotesque nightmare, Laukavai has one thing that most vampires don't: restraint. She seeks mortals as unworthy prey and prefers to hunt beasts. In fact, she might be as old as the Age of Myth. At most near the end of it, as she was also a vampire during the Age of Chaos. During that time, when she was pursuing a Tzeentchian sorcerer, Said sorcerer threw her into an ooze of magic, and the mutations she went through turned her into a Vengorian Lord, a title given to vampires whom have suffered through mutations. Almost all devolved into beasts, but Lauka, through sheer willpower, was able to retain her sanity and claim the sorcerer's head. Her Askurgan kin believed that she was far too corrupted, and they sought to take her life. So in a fit of rage, Lauka slew them to the last and then fled to the wastes. There she found the Avengorii vampire that worshipped her monstrous form. And that way she found the Avengorii Dynasty. During the era of the beast, the Askurgan Troublades were reformed, and the Mother of Nightmares is greatly offended. To slay these pretenders might be the thing that drives her over the edge of madness. Among the last major dynasties, the final one is the Kastelai Dynasty. Their belief is that they must spend their own life to hone their martial skills. They ride out with their Blood Knights when the accursed fortress known as the Bloodkeep manifests in the sky. Any vampire, regardless of bloodline, can join the Kastelai Dynasty. Their sense of honor is essentially a mutual love of slaughter, and to see who can kill more enemies than the other. The Crimson Keep is an accursed keep that manifests in the darkest of nights, and within its walls there are tongueless necroscribes who tell of the greatest vampire warriors of ancient times, some even dating back to the world that was. Tales tell of an undead knight that slew an emperor dragon and drinking its blood permanently sated its thirst. The Kastelai also seek to drink the blood of a drake, for it could clearly free a vampire from the chains of Nagash. Which leads me to their leader, Prince Vordai, who among the major matriarchs and the patriarchs of the Soulblight dynasties is the most brazen about wanting to be free of Nagash's influence. When Archeon the Ever-Chosen struck down Nagash, Vordai went out of his way to escape Nagash's influence, and only by Archon the Black was he defeated. Archon put Vordai into a realmstone coffin and left him there until Nagash was resurrected. When Nagash came back and judged him, he cursed him to be bound by the Crimson Keep. If he leaves it for more than a night, he will meet an excruciatingly painful death. Even with all of this, Prince Vordai does not hide his hatred for the great necromancer, and gathers like-minded vampires under him under the guise of seeking martial perfection. Across the realms, Vordai hunts for scholars, necromancers, and lore to find a way to break free of Nagash's grasp. Aside from that, Vordai seeks to slay Kragnos, the ender of empires himself. With the dynasties and some of the named characters covered, onto the units and the combat doctrine of the Soulblight. The Soulblight are led by vampire lords, which command hordes of undead. Their mere presence is what is able to keep these shambling corpses and piles of bone and armor walking. For every vampire lord is a powerful necromancer that can command entire armies. They must sate their blood thirst regularly, so they are oftentimes seen drinking the gore of their fallen foes, even if they don't happen to be as sustaining as human or elf blood. If a vampire lord is slain or flees the battlefield, this very horde will go back from the very dust they sprang from. But not all vampires are lords. In fact, there are more Blood Knights than there are vampire lords. Blood Knights are vampires clad in blood-red armor, called Bloodplate, with lances that can puncture the toughest of hides and thickest of armor. They are one of the most, if not the deadliest cavalry group in all of the mortal realms. These Blood Knights are the stuff of nightmares, where the only thing you can hope to do is that make sure your cavalry charges them first, or you pick them off enough to the point they have been weakened. These knights have their own warped sense of honor, and even have their own knightly orders. Some rarely fight alongside mortals out of this sense of honor. However, most Blood Knights look down upon the mortals with complete and utter contempt, as underneath their supposed chivalry is ultimately a bloodthirsty monster. Some vampires, however, see walking on the battlefield as something low as a zombie would do. Instead, they float across the battlefield upon what are referred to as Coven Thrones. On these thrones tend to be more than one vampire. They can be seen just lounging and pretending to be pompous aristocrats mid-battle, and as soon as something comes close to them, they will reveal their bloodthirsty nature and feast upon the blood of their enemies. They will collect blood off the battlefield for ritual use, and use it to see the future. This was invented by Neferata, and for this reason, most Coven thrones happen to be found on the Legion of Blood. Then there is the Bloodseeker Palanquin, which are operated by Sanguinarchs, who are essentially vampire cultists. Like mortals, vampires have their own obsessive cliques. For these Sanguinarchs, blood is not to be treated like any other food or drink. No. They believe blood should be treated like aged wine. These Sanguinarchs also act as infiltrators in the mortal cities, manipulating nobles, gathering blood, and selling it to vampire lords. In battle, these palanquins are carried by screeching geists as they extract the blood of their champions, enemies' champions rather, via their exsanguination sorceries. The ultimate purpose is to craft the ultimate vintage of gore, and they see this as an art form. But what happens if a vampire cannot sustain itself by drinking blood? Well, they turn into Vargeists. A Vargeist is the endpoint for all vampires, especially if they are deprived of blood for too long. Their muscles will swell to hideous proportions, their limbs lengthen, and their hands and feet devolve into hideous sharp claws. Their arms will have leathery wings, and their faces will become more bat-like, with their previous sapience now replaced with that of a savage animal. Once this transformation is complete, there is no going back. A Vargeist will show deference towards the elders of its lineage until the scent of blood is in the air, which they will turn into bloodthirsty beasts, and for these, they can never have enough blood, as they are always thirsty. Some vampires look at Vargeists with contempt and dread. Some, like the Vyrkos and the Avengorii, however, see these creatures to be sacred and in touch with the true nature of being a vampire. There are the Fell Bats, which are not vampires but normal bats, enchanted by vampires to be their thralls. They grow in size and develop a lust for blood. They swoop upon their prey and overwhelm them with their large numbers. The blood they drink are held in large sacs found in their throat, which once a vampire slits it open, they can indulge in sating their thirst without fighting an enemy individually. Speaking of, there is a group of vampire warriors based off of Gore called the Oskurgan Trueblades. They are not the originals, however, but rather vampires who have braved the flesh-tearing sandstorms of Gore to find the ancient monasteries of the originals, filled with lore that explains that according to legend, drinking the blood of titans and behemoths will not only elevate their martial skills, but allow them to better suppress their curse and even free them from the bloodthirst. So these vampires have resurrected the order and became beast hunters, shedding the sophisticated attires and armor of their Shaishian kin. They have found formidable egos, and they are often hired by other vampires as beast killers. But should the bloodthirst be too strong to ignore, a true blade will transform into something called Curse Blood, where they will forever be cursed to be a savage beast, not exactly like a Vorgeist, but like a savage beast of gore. Now I will be moving on to the Bone Warriors of the Soulblights, led by White Kings. These pile of bones are the remains of monarchs of the Mortal Realms during the Age of Myth. But when Nagash got a hold of many a kingdom that fell to chaos, especially on Shyish, he resurrected their fallen monarchs, army and civilians without their consent, and took away their free will. Where there is not chaos dreadholes on Shyish, there are Bonerattle kingdoms led by these White Kings. Although they have a greater sense of individuality than most undead, the only humanity that is left of them is the urge to rule and some quirks from their time in life. These monarchs' sense of self is so strong, the only undead that can command them are vampires. Knowing that the vampires are invaluable allies, they oftentimes put their pride aside and ally with a vampire lord to use his or her vast resources to further expand their territories and provide ample life force to the vampire. However, White Kings are known for their fierce independence, such as Jadeskull, Emperor of Halost, and King Morlach Velmorn, who is the self-proclaimed ruler of Gnarlwood in Gore. And these Bonerattle kingdoms can be found everywhere, even in Gyron, where there is the Kingdom of Decreptia. The skeletons inhabiting it are covered with vines and corpse fungi, or there are many decrepit ruins in Ulgu that hide outposts of such kingdoms. Then there are the foot soldiers of the White Kings, which are, well, skeletons, or as GW's copyrighted name goes, Bonerattle skeletons. They, in many ways, embody Nagash's Necrotopia. They are sterile and stagnant, just bare bones, the fate that awaits all living creatures. Now, not all skeletons, however, are under the control of a White King. Skeletons can also be controlled by necromancers and vampires who brought them back from death. However, what is exclusive to the White Kings are the Graveguard, who are said king's personal custodians. These in life were the closest to a White King. However, in death, they are bound to said White King and Nagash, of course, which grants them greater freedom than most undead. However, this freedom is only enough for them to recall their lethality and entertain their sire with tales from centuries past. Finally, the Bonerattles have their own version of the Blood Knights, simply referred to as Black Knights. These were once the nobility of the Bonerattle kingdoms that were buried along their steeds. When Nagash raised them from undeath, they became monsters thirsty for battle, always demanding that they are to be sent first towards the enemy lines and are the hammers of the Bonerattle kingdoms. They claim to be the finest cavalry of Grand Alliance death, which oftentimes leads to a rivalry between them, the Blood Knights, and the Kavalos Death Riders of the Ossiarch legions. And finally, there's The Walking Dead. Not the TV show, I mean zombies resurrected by necromancers and vampire lords. Now, the difference between an amethyst wizard and a necromancer is simple. The former respects the cycle of life and death, respects the dead, and uses the purple wind of magic to weaken enemies and lead them to faster deaths. The latter, however, is a slippery slope to chasing immortality, because tell me someone who is content with the things he has and I'll show you a liar. The prospect of dominion over life and death, alongside the prospect of immortality, is particularly tempting for some. But in this pursuit, the necromancers start turning into hollow, gaunt humanoids forever chasing that promise of immortality, only to be ensnared by the greatest necromancer of them all, Nagash. There are many ways to fall into this temptation, such as tribal spirit speakers encountering heterodox knowledge, or being an amethyst wizard whom their lust for knowledge got the better of them. Regardless, most necromancers are cowed into the service of a vampire lord, like a White King in Promise of Lore, or maybe the Blood Kiss, the ritual that turns someone into a vampire, and only few rise high. In the end, the fate of all necromancers is to be a slave to Nagash. These necromancers oftentimes raise zombies for them to do their battles. Individually, they are not much of a threat. In bulk, however, they are dangerous. Uncaring of their losses, they mindlessly hurl themselves onto the front lines, hoping that they will get their decaying hands on a mortal to devour their flesh. Thanks to Shayashian magic, whereas bites are usually not an effective way to carry an infection, the necrotic energies pass on to the victim, eventually turning them into a zombie as well. However, necromancers are not the only one that can raise these rotting corpses to life. Sometimes the Wind of Death itself does on its own, starting a zombie apocalypse in Shyish. Yeah, not even the wildlife is safe, as the Purple Wind can also raise the dead wolves back to life, like a necromancer. These wolves have none of the swiftness they had in life, traded in with jaws and fangs that can rip apart a cavalry charger or chew through full plate armor. These undead are sometimes resurrected by what are called corpse carts. These grotesque altars of death have bodies writhe and moan in pain. They are operated by corpse masters whom are neither truly alive nor dead, who use their power of the cart to reanimate the undead or embolden them with vigor, making them more ferocious in the process. Finally, there is the Mortis engine, which are formed by the acolytes of a powerful necromancer. They essentially gather his remains to form this weapon of mass destruction. It is both a magnet and conductor for necrotic energies, which they use to cast powerful spells. This engine even has a failsafe where it essentially self-destructs, and when it does, it will send a shockwave of amethyst magic that can pulverize entire regiments to dust. With that, this is the end of the Soulblight Gravelords lore. I'm the Nameless Scholar, and Iron Within, Iron Without.